It has come to my attention that some of you don't know the first thing about the Middle Ages. And I, in my responsibility as Professor Fulton Brown, consider it a public service to answer the questions that you have, however stupid they may be. We're going to make this a regular thing, but you got to help me get started tonight by asking some really good questions. So I've set Casey up to get you all warmed up. But bring your questions tonight because we're going there on the Mosaic Ark. We have our first stupid question from Mel in unauthorized chat. Who is John Galt? I'm not going to answer that because it has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. Good grief. So welcome everyone to, we're calling this stupid question day, but that's actually Vox's catchphrase. So maybe we need to come up with a different one to mean the same thing, which is all stupid questions are the ones that you're too embarrassed to ask and think you probably should be able to answer. But if you don't ever ask them, you never get any smarter. So we just we're going to model how to do this better, right? By asking the stupid questions. And I will demonstrate how impossible it is to, no. The thing is that in the streams that we've been doing the last few months, occasionally sort of matters of history have come up, and I've realized that I'm being unfair to Casey, expecting her to know as much as I do, and that that it.
I fake being semi-literate very well.
Hey, you can scan. You've done your homework. I trust you. And if I give you something to read, you will consider it and come back with something different that you know. But the thing is, this is no. And I was prepping, in sort of less jokey way of thinking. It's like, there's the memes about, what I think I do, what my mom thinks I do, blah, 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 blah. And, I think I said this even maybe last week before. I've had students in my own classes who have therefore spent weeks with me talking through things and, me giving them exercises and stuff. And then they'll ask me so what do you do in the summer? Because it's like this giant black box. And it's, even if I have been assigning in class things I've written, I think most people think that writing just comes out of, I don't know, time and a montage, right? If you have a montage and a lot of,
writing montage,
and bango, there's the work, right? It's very.
I wish.
The montage part works. It's just, as Vox says, when he's, most of his life is spent sitting at that desk that he's streaming from. It takes so much longer than you think to sit down and work through everything and think through all the details and write. And what's ironic is, of course, once it's written, then the labor is different for the reader. I mean, there's a lot of labor in reading too. That's like the slowness of actually absorbing, thinking through, keeping threads of what you've been learning from. It's like reading is a very intensive practice. It's hard for people to appreciate that, I think.
What happens when you spend so much time writing something and then and then somebody just, they love it and they breeze through it and they're like, wow, that was great. I finished it in 2 days. What's next? Right. And it's,
give me another decade.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but that's what's funny. It's sort of, this is a kind of theological reality of it, that the labor of writing, Dorothy Sayers compares it to, you know, Christ's incarnation, right? It's like the labor of putting something into words and the patience to put the thoughts together in a way that someone not being able to talk to you can follow. People can find writing is incredibly alienating of yourself, because you're trying to write something that someone else, having no contact with you, having zero idea who you are, can engage with, right? So it's actually quite challenging, but interesting. Once you've done that, once you've thought the thought through and articulated it and put it down it goes out into the world, and then it can feed all sorts of other thoughts. It's actually fine if people read the book quickly. When they come back and sort of blithely ask when the next one's, like, well,
Midnight's War.
I have no, you know, and obviously some people write faster than others, and some people, you know, there's different kinds of writing practice, but yeah, anyway, so we're here to get you started. I have different ideas for what I'm going to call this stream. You'll know by the time I published it, but the sort of beginner's guide, how to think about the Middle Ages. I don't know. It's like stupid question day seems to be appropriate. so not with John
my
Galt.
questions will not disappoint.
What? Okay, well, let's see if. Okay, Mel is. What's the best thing? Mel. Okay, Nibmeister. You guys, you got to ask questions about not Chicago, about the Middle Ages. Okay. Who is John Galt? He's the protagonist in Atlas Shrugged. Duh. Okay. Nibmeister. My son is moving to Chicago in the summer. What's the best thing to do in Chicago? The best thing? Go to Mass at St. John Cantius.
Oh, I wish I could do that. It looks beautiful.
It's in Latin.
I do.
And we show scenes from St. John Cantius every stream, right? Our background is from a window of showing the sacraments at Cantius, and our altars, whatever you call that, it's pan up the altar to the resurrection. Yeah. That's the altar at Cantius. So that's the best thing to do in Chicago. Are there medieval questions? Anybody have medieval questions?
Yeah, the medieval questions. It's a Gothic style. That's close to a medieval question, right?
Cantius? No, Cantius isn't Gothic. It's
no?
So it's Polish. The people who built it, they were Polish immigrants in the early 20th century in Chicago, and the community was mainly from Krakow, and so there's the altarpiece painting of the St. John Cantius has him fixing the milk jug for the girl, which is a whole nother thread. And they're standing in front of St. Mary's in Krakow, which is a beautiful medieval church. I've seen photographs of it. And we actually have in St. John Cantius, we have a replica, a smaller scale replica of a Veit Stoss altarpiece that's actually in St. Mary's in Krakow. So that's medieval. But that
is really cool. What a nice connection that community had to its home. It's its original home when they built that.
Yeah. So Father Joshua, who's the prior of the community, when I heard him, give his tour about talking about it, and say, it's like when the people they could see their home from where, they're in Chicago praying, and there's the altarpiece. It's like this window back home. But for me, since I've never been there now, for me, it's this window to the past. I mean, to Cantius, he was alive in the 15th century, and to this whole tradition of Christianity from further east than I've actually traveled in Europe. I haven't been as far east as Krakow, and I'm the more we learn about Silesia and the angel of Silesius, whose verse we found out mimics one of ours or backwards mimicking from Aurora Borealis and such. Like I have to get to Krakow. And the reason I've seen some beautiful pictures of the interior of St. Mary's is because the same photographer takes pictures of corgis, because he has 4.
Always a corgi connection
There's a
there.
corgi connection. I went to say to Father Joshua once, and like, you got to see these pictures. They're in front of St. Mary's Krakow, and it's all corgis. And he's like,
That's
that's
cute.
nice. Anyway, so go to St. John Cantius if you're in Chicago, because there's lots of layers of imagery there. But no, the church itself, it's more of a kind of Baroque Byzantine style, because it's
Okay.
like the that
For the
style
Silver
of
East.
full background gold mosaics and such. You think of like St. Mark's in Venice, which is echoing Hagia Sophia in Constantinople.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not Gothic. I don't know what it's supposed to, I mean, the windows are I don't know what it's supposed to be. It was their beloved church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was a medieval church. So I'm trying to find the medieval connection for you here with St. John Cantius. So the picture of the church in Krakow, you said was a medieval
Yes.
church.
Yes. And there's
There you
the
go. There's your
replica of
connection.
the Veit Stos was a very great wood carver. He's famous for this altarpiece in St. Mary's in Krakow, and also for this rosary Annunciation. It's a hanging image. I think they're life size, and it's got the garland of the rosary around Gabriel and Mary, and it like hangs from the ceiling of this church.
Very cool.
Yeah. So he's one of the great late medieval German wood carvers, and we have a replica of one of his pieces in St. John Cantius in Chicago. So there's
That's
a good
wonderful.
medieval connection. We actually have. We've got some real questions. Let's go. Okay, so Casey, because she does her homework, has some questions prepared. But I think we can start.
No, go with them.
We can start
That's
with some
okay.
of these. So Linguist Bear says, "Can you explain the designation of the Middle Ages and how that is distinct from other time periods?" Yes, it's a slur. So the Middle Ages.
I would not have guessed that. Wow.
It's like Reformation is a slur. The Reformers, that's a slur too. It's interesting how many of these periodization labels, one, they're usually obviously they're retrospective because the people at the time don't call themselves medieval. The Renaissance, I don't know, they do consider themselves being in a kind of rebirth of culture and such, but the Reformers in the 16th century called themselves evangelical. So whatever, right? But the Middle Ages comes out of, there's layers to the situation. It now it simply means what the Enlightenment called the period during the peak of Roman Catholicism, right? Because it typically begins with Constantine in the early fourth century, and Constantine's conversion to Christianity, and ends variously, say 1492 with Columbus's discovery of the New World, or 1517 with Luther's nailing his theses on the door at Wittenberg and starting the protest, which we call the Reformation now, the Protestants, right? Or with the invention of the printing press, so that you have a big technological change. But in fact, what it is saying, and the English reformers, because we're doing this in English and we're talking about the Middle Ages in English. For the English, the Middle Ages is, the period during which the church, originally founded through Gregory the Great's mission to Canterbury in 597, loses its way and gets sucked in by the papacy, and we finally freed ourselves from that with Henry VIII and the Reformation. So it's mainly a categorization for the period that later historians considered most dominated by the church. Therefore, it gets lumped in with calling things the Dark Ages, which is not exactly the same period, really.
What would you say is the defining feature of the Middle Ages in contrast to what they would say?
Well, the thing is, they're not wrong. It is a period of great, sort of coherence in Christendom. And the changes that take place when the Spanish begin their exploration of the Americas, and when the Protestants in Germany, because the Spanish are distracted by finding New World and things like that, the German empire that's also supposed to be under Charles starts breaking up, and he can't really control it. And then the English breaking off from Rome. The thing is that sort of rupture in the story does make sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's more chaotic.
Right. But it's
Yeah.
meant to be, it's like there's antiquity, which is, the Roman Empire, or the Greco-Roman Empire, the Hellenistic, and for the Enlightenment, that's the Great Period, right? That's why all of our national architecture
Mm.
now is, looks like
That
Roman
explains a
temples.
lot.
And
It explains the return to paganism too.
yes,
That impulse.
right. And then the Dark Ages, I mean, you could say the whole of the medieval period is the Dark Ages because it's under the thumb of Rome, as in the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
There's also the sense of there's a period after the fall of Rome, to the Germanic warlords, um, during which we just don't have that many details of what's going on. There's not, we don't have chronicles. We don't even have them for Constantinople during some of this period. Like the 7th century is really like we have no idea. Although the 7th century is enormously important because that's when Islam gets off the ground. So
Hmm.
Dark Ages tend to mean historiographically we just don't know the specifics of names and narrative details, but
Hmm.
how you evaluate the significance of the period depends on your own perspective of um, whose side you play on in the storytelling, typically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. Palaya, what were the literacy rates? We'll come back to that in a second. Um, Nimmeister, have you listened to the Hardcore History podcast, Twilight of the Aesir Viking Invasions? I haven't listened to that many podcasts. Is that the songs? I was listening to some of the songs, which are hilarious. Um, okay, Mel's asking, what were the literacy rates? Why does that matter? Right? Is the first thing you should ask. Literacy is
Right.
a particular kind of technology. If the kings are literate or not, we have this impression that, because historians depend on writing, that everything important is things that are written down, but in fact loads of important things can happen only orally or in records that are lost. So Palaya, why would you want to know what the literacy rates are? Think about that and re-ask the question. Okay.
Right. So that's a modern standard of living question. Right. I think
Right.
my opinion is what it really means is you have leisure time to be literate.
Well, so the thing is, people sometimes say like, "Oh, the church had monopoly on literacy in the time," and it's like, yeah, that's like saying, the church specialized in prayer, right?
Right.
That
Hospitals have a monopoly on medicine, right? Or doctors.
well,
Or
so it's saying that the church is the one that cares about writing stuff down, and mainly what they wrote down
right.
during the long period that we're talking about, say, 4th to 14th century, is their liturgy. So it's like the primary use of literacy during the period is prayer, and then
And communication, right? Letters back and forth, and a lot of that had to do with discussing this.
right. I mean, some of it's business letters and but the thing, if you're gonna if to send a message you have to send it by a person, you might have a letter that has certain authorization characteristics, like with a seal or introduce it, but the
Yeah.
real business could still be done orally,
Right.
right? So what we think of as literacy as a kind of necessary technology is affected by what we think literacy is for. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
we can get let's start with some of your questions, and we'll get into more about the layers of education.
My questions?
Yeah, let's start with your questions.
Well, some of them are too dumb. I have to follow up on those not dumb questions,
Well,
people.
the
But
Middle
she said
Ages,
dumb
that was a good
questions.
question. No, ask me the dumb questions. I
Exactly.
was ready for the dumb questions to start with.
You're right. The dumb questions.
Yeah.
Okay. These are really dumb. All right. This is a combination of some things I heard when I was a kid and even as an adult and other kids I asked. Okay. Did people really never bathe or bathe only once a year in the Middle Ages?
That's the kind of question I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's that. So what's interesting about that is, when they stopped bathing was really the 16th century.
Really?
Yes, because baths during the Middle Ages, what's interesting about it is like, particularly for the period when we have towns. Okay, let me back up. This is why the literacy question was hard. One, we're talking about a whole 1,000 years, right? And
Yeah.
in the earlier part of this period, you have the Roman Empire is falling apart. They don't have, great international trade anymore, though there's still some trade. Towns tend to shrink, and people are living mainly in the countryside on manors and growing crops and stuff like that. From around the 11th century, the towns start getting built back up. Although in places like northern Italy, they're still always around. Like the towns are still there. Although, particularly in northern Italy, they'd been like wiped out by first the Ostrogoths, and then Belisarius is trying to reconquer them for Justinian, and then the Lombards, and then the Carolinians. It's like there's layers of conquest and disruption in different regions throughout the period. But roughly from the 10th, 11th century, from the 11th century, you start having more towns. Towns have things like public baths. We know that.
Right, from the because the Romans had them, right? So maybe they just kind of inherited the habit.
Well, so
possibly?
the Roman baths are pretty technologically complicated, right? That they have various heating systems and
Right.
floor heating and things like that. But I think the late medieval towns don't have big baths like the Romans did. They're not giant gymnasia, health club sort of level. But they do have baths. The reason that they start getting shut down is the plague. In the 14th century. And it does take a while for people to start realizing, there's certain kinds of association that are more likely to cause transmission of the disease. But it's really by the 16th century that people kind of stop bathing. So the fiction that we have of, how filthy or whatever people were, it doesn't hold for the Middle Ages. It can hold for other periods, but not the Middle Ages. Ironically,
it's so odd because obviously, if you're not washing, you're spreading germs more readily. I think if you're not washing more often.
Well,
at least, well, if you
the plague was pretty overwhelming, so they didn't really know why everybody died so quickly, and they tried out a lot of things to figure out how to deal with it. The other thing, adjacent to do they bathe, is like, were their teeth all rotten? This I can answer in more detail, actually.
Yeah, it's another good question. Yeah.
No, there weren't, because they didn't have a lot of sugar.
Right.
Their teeth were fine.
Sugar's
you know
bad.
whose teeth are really
Sugar's bad
rotten
for
and
your teeth.
gross? You'll like this because it fits with what we're writing. The Elizabethans. You want to know why they're really rotten and gross? The Elizabethans. This is not what you might expect.
I can't imagine what is causing all this bad tooth decay everywhere.
Currants.
Not Coca-Cola. Okay.
Not Coca-Cola. No, in the 16th century, the Elizabethans, the English have this incredible passion for currants, right? Like little raisins.
Isn't that crazy?
Little, you get them in scones.
And is it because that they have super high amount of sugar and they weren't used to it? So
yeah, they're like high on currants, and they're terrible for your teeth. The only thing worse for your teeth is potato chips.
That is so strange.
Yeah, and so the English famously in the 16th century have really bad breath and bad teeth, but it's because they're eating so much sugar. Whereas in the Middle Ages, no, people didn't have sugar. It was so precious they use it as like a precious spice, and for the sick, it's like medicine level kind of sugar. That we have bad teeth now is industrial production of sugar from the 19th century.
Yes, poured into everything because it makes it tastier and people want extra of it. They eat extra of it when it's in it. It was one of the recipes in Hildegard of Bingen's one of her medicinal books. It was for a sore stomach. Sugar could cure a sore stomach.
Right.
And doctors still today even will recommend it for a sore stomach.
So I did a little paper on the metaphor of sweetness. This is one of those things I can actually answer in horrific detail. And I got very interested in, so when, for example, in the 12th century, monks talk a lot about, taste and see the Lord is sweet. It's one of the Psalms, and they play off of this because it's like, taste in Latin, has the same root word as wisdom. And so, the sweetness gives you wisdom and things like that. And I'm like, well, what's sweet? And for them, almonds are. Almonds, right? We are so saturated with sweet now that things that they considered actually incredibly sweet, almonds they considered sweet.
That's amazing. It's like you would only experience that if you went on a keto diet or something and ate nothing but like meat and fat and no sugar whatsoever.
Right.
After about 3 days, an almond will taste like it's coated in chocolate and sugar, probably, just because it's got a carbohydrate in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But they ate a lot of carbohydrates. I mean, it wasn't their diet. It wasn't meat heavy, was it? Or is that another stupid question?
So, I've done, there are actually references for all of these things if you guys want to go read them. And one of the things I've done is a course on animals in the Middle Ages. And that's very interesting because we have things like household accounts from the later Middle Ages. The varieties of fish they would eat, particularly in the noble houses, were enormous. Just like, we have tuna, right? They have fish I don't even know what are. Never mind eels, right? Dolphins, whale, haddock. There's incredible like carp farming in the later Middle Ages, so they eat a lot of fish.
Not like the Japanese even today. They eat like an incredible variety of seafood, and the Spanish too, I think, from what I've heard.
Right. So obviously in an ordinary diet, the peasantry is not eating as much meat as the nobility, but they have pork that they salt in the winters, right? The killing season for the pigs would be in the winter, like Martinmas or thereabouts, right? In the calendars, they're slaughtering the pigs and they salt the meat. So they have that. They have chickens, so they have eggs and chickens. I'm not sure how much beef people would eat normally because in the manors, they're using the oxen for plowing, and so they're like business. They're machines, right? Rather than
you're getting milk, and cheese and butter from it too,
right?
And cream,
right?
So you don't. I mean, it's easy to slaughter a pig because that's all you get from a pig is meat.
Right. So they do eat a lot of pork, and particularly in England by the later Middle Ages, that they're doing a lot of sheep farming, which is wool, and also for books and everything they use the parchment. They use the skins for writing on. So I'm assuming they'll eat the sheep too, but yeah.
Okay, here's a follow-up stupid question. How long does vellum last? Isn't that what it's called? Isn't it the sheepskin that they write on?
Oh, it's really durable. It lasts incredibly well.
No, that's why they used it.
It's funny because again, the impressions that people have about things like if you go to a library now, for example, one of the libraries that I worked in as a graduate student at Columbia's library, it's an older university for the United States, so it has lots of books from the 18th, 19th century. The 19th century books are incredibly fragile, right? You open them up and they go poof, and you're sitting there making a photocopy of it and going, I'm breaking the book.
Right.
That is really high acid paper, and it interacts with the pollution in the city air, and it just crumbles away. Parchment doesn't do that. And older paper doesn't do that. It's like rag and it will last a long time. The things that will get parchment are catching fire. So the libraries catch fire, but even then they don't, if a book is closed, they don't burn that fast. So some of the manuscripts we have in the British Library collection, the Cotton collection, caught fire, and some of them were lost, right? But a lot of them were burned just around the edges. So no, parchment is
well, there were those scrolls from Pompeii that lasted. They couldn't unroll them because they would corrode, but I mean, they were rolled up. I just saw a news item on this. I've seen it before. These 3 students won $700,000 or pounds or something like that by being able to figure out how to read it using modern technology, because they couldn't unroll them because they found them in the 18th century. They tried to unroll them and they immediately started disintegrating. So they said, stop, don't unroll them anymore. They knew what they were, but they couldn't read them. So they were able to actually read through these things. But they survived. They survived Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed everything.
So
It incinerated everything except stone.
those I don't think were parchment.
They must have been skins then, right?
No, in the Empire they used papyrus.
Oh, that's very delicate though,
Yes,
isn't it?
that disintegrates.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's actually pretty astounding. Well, maybe it was stuck in stone. I don't know where they found it. That's astounding that they found them. They might have been stored in some stone where maybe.
Right. No, so
Yeah.
this is the irony of what survives. So, for example, the classics that we have, the Roman classics, they all survive in medieval manuscripts. I think we have fragments of things like Virgil and stuff from the ancient period. The manuscripts survive, particularly from the 8th and 9th century, the Carolingian manuscripts, and they were presumably they're recopying them onto parchment because the papyrus doesn't last.
Yeah.
And
what is
the literacy question is complicated by the fact that, for example, the popes in their chancery used papyrus well into the 11th century.
Why?
Habit, I think. I mean, like a bureaucracy, it's more like paper, right? And much of the papal archive is gone.
Yeah. So what is parchment made of?
Skin. It's the
skin.
Of the animals. Yeah.
I thought that had a different name.
So vellum is the calf skin and parchment's the sheepskin. Well,
gotcha.
I mean, parchment's they're different grades of skin, and there's a lot of scholarship right now on testing the actual animal skins. Sometimes it's goat, but we can tell a lot of things about, like, where the animals lived and how many it took to make the book and things like that. Yeah, it's a huge industry making that many books.
So in the 19th century, then they changed to paper. So they basically went back to papyrus because it's a wood pulp, and it's very delicate again. But I mean, what they lacked in quality, they made up for in quantity because they could just make a lot of it, right?
Right, and paper becomes paper starts being used in, I think, like the 13th century, but it doesn't really become as common until later.
Speaking of paper, I have another stupid question. It has absolutely nothing to do with literacy, and it has some kind of connection to the riots of 2020. Not those riots, the toilet paper riots. Oh. What did they use?
I'm not really sure.
They did not have toilet paper. I stumped you.
Yeah, well, hey, I didn't say I could answer all the stupid questions. I can tell you where to look, right? One of my friends, Martha Bayless, wrote a book on, the uses of excrement in literature. So the people with the best plumbing were monks, right? We know things like they would have running water through their communities. And there's a very famous drawing of the water system at Canterbury. And you could see, like, they'll have flush toilets in the sense that there'll be seats with a hole underneath and the drains out. I think mostly though it was dug pits, right? And you have to redig it and move it. I've seen drawings in Your Life in the Castle that they would put hang the furs over the garter robe, right? They hang the furs in the fumigated part of where you're pooping down because it helps keep the moths off. Oh. However,
hygiene was not great, despite the fact that they did bathe. Okay.
Well, no. Okay. So it depends on what you count as hygiene, right? We think of cities. Oh, the cities are all filthy. It's like, no. The one thing we have are regulations from the cities about what to do with your filth, right? City governments exist to deal with the fact that your neighbors just threw stuff on the street. So.
Right out the window. This is why you don't walk on the inside. You walk on the outside of the building.
And when things got really smelly, there's famous stories of, like, London getting really smelly and like the 14th century. Those are people didn't like it, right? They tried to mitigate it. For urine though, you need that to make gunpowder. So there's a lot of
Oh,
you use urine and things like
nitrogen?
fulling cloth and dye fixing and things like that. The tanneries would smell terrible because they're fixing all this stuff in
Yeah.
urine, and they're
I
also
thought it was because it was just, well, actually I didn't know. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. If it was urine, that's why it smelled terrible, because the older it gets, the worse it smells.
mm, but I guess for the ammonia, I'm not. I haven't the technical elements of tanning. I'm not that aware of. But I once had young children trying to keep them occupied on a trip and saying it's like how many things you can think of to use urine for. It's very.
Was that a safe question to ask young children?
It's better than what they were talking about.
They're going to start experimenting. Oh,
I mean, I think that this was the interesting thing about doing the animals course, that people couldn't live without animals. We're so mechanized now. I mean, even with like
mhm.
transportation and horses and such, that I think not only do we not appreciate what it was like just to live around other human beings in
Yeah.
human-sized situations, the degree to which the animals made it possible to be human is something we've really lost
Yeah.
sight of.
Mm. Well, yeah. Other than pets, people don't really understand there's a relationship outside of that does not involve cruelty. It does involve eating and using them, but does not involve cruelty.
Right.
This is what modern people can't wrap their heads around. It's like, oh, well, why would you eat something you love? It's like you don't love it like a person. It's not the same thing.
Right.
It's because we're so removed from that, from farm life, or just from being around the corner from a butcher, even,
Right.
right, where you would see the animals being prepared. People were closer to their food, and their food, yes, had a face, and yeah,
And it tended to. So this is we also have
yeah,
things like butcher regulations for understanding, like how you make sure that they're cleaning the blood off and things like that in the streets. But yeah,
hmm,
it's way easier. This is a period when transportation is by cart or feet,
yeah,
right? So
right,
if your meat's going to walk to
yeah,
town and will be slaughtered there, it's not going to be carried in carts.
yes.
You know,
Yeah, I'm always fascinated. Every year, there's a tradition where is it sheep or cattle that are driven across London Bridge, or one of the bridges in London.
that I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, I wish I could remember it, but yeah, it's done once a year, and it has to. And I want to say it has something to do with the City of London, and one of their privileges, but I'm not sure about that. But it's very old. It's been going on for a long time. But I think it's back to the days where, yeah, you would drive the cattle in, and they did this in Chicago. They would drive the cattle in, they would slaughter them there. It was a great slaughtering center.
Right.
And then they would ship all the meat out. But so that was done in London too. So even in the city, you saw the animals you ate,
Right.
right?
Right.
And the hides that were tanned and turned into leather.
Right. It's curious. So one of the papers that I assigned the students for this animals course is trying to figure out how many animals there were. And it's actually harder to do than you think, because although literacy again, we have fairly detailed records of things like particularly the monastic properties that were raising sheep and things like that. It's and we know, for example, that the oxen have to be used for the plows, although horses are used from the 12th century when they get a better like collar for them so they don't strangle when they're pulling the plow. Communities like the manors would have a certain number of oxen in team and be able to plow their land and such that way. It's still hard to figure out exactly how many animals there were, but lots, right? It's like
A lot.
it's they're folded into people's lives in a way that it's just, I mean, people that raise chickens now get like a little bitty slice of what the world was like when it was people and animals everywhere.
Well, I mean, how many nursery rhymes involve farm animals?
Right.
Probably quite a few of them, right?
Yep.
So that's a good clue. Let's see. Oh, I'm going to ask more health questions. Let's see. Do people really die in their 30s typically?
People mainly died in childhood. It's like the you know the babies. I mean, this. I was thinking about this with our conversation about the demons last week, saying why would you want to be make sure to have infant baptism? It's like you want to protect them from the
Yes.
demons. And I was
Yeah.
realizing that when we were talking about it with John, that yes, you're going to want to like baptize them as soon as you can, because you don't know, you don't know how long, and the infants would die. Childhood death was quite high, and then there was risk for women dying in childbirth for sure. But you'd also be having quite a number of children, so it's like not every birth was a risk of dying. It's more like you have a fair number. But the thing is, from what we've been able to tell from records about how big the families were, ordinary families were kind of ordinary size, 3 or 4 kids. It's not, they didn't all have 12. That's actually quite hard, and aristocratic, more having lots and lots of children. The thing is, I think people probably tended to die more in their 50s or 60s if they got through childhood. It's like you get average population figures. If you get through childhood, if you don't get killed in some kind of accident, if the men are going off to war and getting killed that way, which isn't as like common as you think, because pitched battles were pretty rare. Like, it's dumb. Big pitched battles, the big sort of lines of marching guys is really 17th, 18th century, right? That they didn't do that in the Middle Ages. They did sieges more, right? So yeah, there's a lot of ways you could die, but no, everybody didn't like Logan's Run drop dead at 30.
That's so 30, right? Well, now this is, what was medicine like then, and did people have access to it? Was it effective at all?
Well, they don't have an anesthetic, so surgery is pretty painful. And I mean, they have access to, like you mentioned, Hildegard, right? We have her accounts of her physica, her health remedies and such. Again, I think with the kinds of things that people were dying of, I'm not sure we have medicine for always now. But
I mean, like cancers and things like that.
I don't think cancers were as common, because
or maybe they just didn't know about it because they're mostly internal. Unless it was some kind of a skin cancer, you wouldn't see it, right?
Well, cancer is the crab, right? It's this thing that's latched onto you. I think that they could grow pretty big and people could see them. I mean, I saw that. I saw that in my mom's pathology books, right? It's like the breast cancer that you'd see because it would grow out, right? And you'd see.
Yeah, eventually. Yeah,
that they were little tiny things that you can catch in laser surgery out.
Yeah. So how common was it for like folk medicine, right, to be practiced by people?
Well, okay, so realize this entire stream is going to be about literacy, because it's then about what kinds of sources we have to be able to answer those questions. What we know are things from the monastic context, right? They tend to write down medicines. I mean, the Name of the Rose, you have the guy, the apothecary, right? So we have those sorts of medicines. I'm hesitating about generalizing, because most of the time we don't like have big good demographics anyway for anybody.
Well, one of the things that makes this a stupid question is that currently I think there's a belief amongst us moderns that, or some of us moderns, that witches were just female healers.
Oh, Okay, we can go there.
right?
Bracket that. I was going to answer something else.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we know there were people in particularly in monastic life, which I think was on the one hand very austere, and you could say if they didn't get super fat, because we have actually skeletons from some of the monks in the later Middle Ages. He had too many
Hmm.
gifts of food, and they did get pretty round. Their
Friar
spines,
Tuck. It's
yeah,
real.
their spines show that they were actually
Yeah.
quite hefty. But other people we know, and these are the ones that we actually have biographies for, right? So like if full
Mhm.
biographies for other people, we know they lived into their 80s and 90s, right? So it's the sort of possibility of a lifespan was the same as it is now.
But the richer you were, the more likely I'm guessing, the more likely you were to live longer because you have had access to better types of medicines and food.
Well, you certainly have better food, but you might be bloodlet more and therefore die of other things. I don't know. I mean, it's ironic
Yeah.
because you could. I mean,
Oops.
just like now, right? The rich have access to crazy stuff too. So
Oh, Ozempic. Yeah.
gold.
Yeah.
I mean, this is
Yeah.
yeah. So going back to the sugar and cooking, a lot of what we know of medicine is actually the sort of high level medicinal stuff is keeping your humors balanced with your food, with your
Mhm.
cooking. And so we
Yeah.
have cookbooks from the wealthier households in the later Middle Ages and showing that, you're trying to figure out what the right balance of spices and other ingredients are for health. And
That's so interesting
yeah.
because if you read like Mennonite cookbooks, they had this tradition of seven sweets and seven sours, and it sounds just like what you're describing. It's a balance,
Yeah, they
right?
believe in the Galenic humoral theory, and so but they also believe this is why the sugar is healing because it's warm and moist. So the spice trade. I like saying this. The spice trade is basically a drug trade, which is technically what it is. Dried. It means droga means
Yes.
dried stuff, but they're
Oh, I
using
didn't
it.
know
They're
that.
using it for because it's coming from great distances, right? It's from
Hmm.
Asia. um, that they think of most of the spices, and this comes from antiquity too. They think of them as medicinal in the sense that you need to balance the heat and the cold and the moist and the
Hmm.
um
That sounds very Chinese too. It sounds like Chinese medicine that I've read about. Yeah,
it's the
something
ancient
that's
world, right? They had there's the human beings in Eurasia had been in contact for a long time.
so it's just, right. So that's just means they're just still practicing it.
Right.
Something that we've lost over 100 years because of the modern medical college establishment, right?
Yes. Yes. I
Yeah.
mean, what's funny about it's like you're saying, well, modern medicine. It's like, well, modern medicine's killing a lot of people too. Um,
Yes, it
the
is.
main thing that
Yeah.
did improve people's lifespan in the 19th century was water supply for cities. But the problem for
Sanitation.
the problem for the cities was in the 19th century they were blowing up, right? They were huge. They were massive conglomerations of
Hmm.
people that never existed before. So like
Yeah.
which comes
Right.
first, right? This makes me think. So we do know the people in the countryside probably had a bit better time than the people in the cities. Cities were more likely to be places where people caught things from each other. So the death
Well, the
toll,
living
yeah, the
quarters
death
were
toll in
so
cities
close.
was greater than out in the countryside.
Well, they had epidemics in New York City during the massive immigration
Right.
influxes in the late 19th century too. They had I want to say cholera
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
was they had a cholera epidemic. They had several flu epidemics. My own great grandparents, I found out recently, died in one of them.
Wow.
They were from New York City too. But yeah, there was like it would wipe out the really young and like the old, and the people in between would live. But I think that's is that typical of the Middle Ages too.
Yes.
So like you said, if you lived right, so if you lived past childhood, you were good to go probably until you were 50,
Right. You had
especially if you were a man and didn't have to risk childbirth, right?
right. I mean, just on average, but all of these things, it's like the problem is we don't have like full population statistics for anything really until the 17th century when, for example, in England, you start getting parish records of birth, marriages, and deaths. And so you can start doing like full population statistics on stuff. For the Middle
Mm-hmm.
Ages, we have a few sort of comprehensive surveys. One, Doomsday Book from
Mhm.
1086 in England, which doesn't count the people. It was property registration. It actually gives a better sense of some of the animals and the things like mills and such on the
Mm.
land, but it wasn't it it wasn't like a full population survey. So that doesn't give us. And then we have from the late 13th century some records for England called the Quo Warranto, by what warrant do you hold? And I use one of these texts from the Peterborough Abbey properties, the Manor of Walton, and you can read that and you can figure out exactly how many heads of households there were among the Villains and the Cotters and how much property they had. It's about a square mile, this village, and it was like, I think, how many people did we come up with? It's a few hundred people living on this farm area. Um, it's hard to do like full scale population studies for any of the pre-modern anywhere. So it all feels anecdotal once you start putting it together. I've got her frozen. Okay. Let's see. Nimmeister. Eva, 1539. Can you talk about the biggest differences between Catholicism before and after Aquinas? What was lost? So Aquinas is just one of a number of scholastics in the 13th century, and he doesn't get quite the status that he has in Catholicism until in the late 19th century in terms of the Neo-Thomists and their revamping of Catholic education. So the before and after Aquinas is more from the 19th century. But the major developments in the 13th century Aquinas was a Dominican. The friars changed things, and they're really like preaching in the towns a lot. And you get more laity who are interested in devotional practices and prayer life and such. What declines during the 13th century, partly because you're pulling the people that are interested in the religious life into these town communities, is monasticism. And the major difference intellectually I find between, say, the 12th century and the 13th century is the 12th century authors are more contemplative and mystical is kind of the right word, mystical in their meditations on scripture. But those people from the 12th century are read throughout the later Middle Ages. So the watershed is not quite what you'd imagine between one and after. I hope Casey comes back eventually. Oh no, she's back. Okay, good. I can't hear you. Was the Spanish Inquisition as horrible as history books say? No, it wasn't. And read Henry Kamen, who is the major historian on the Spanish Inquisition now. He actually did a full study of the Inquisition records. And the reason that we have the vision that we do of the Spanish Inquisition being so horrible is Elizabethan Protestant propaganda. Because the Spanish are their great enemy, and it is useful to Elizabeth and subsequent English monarchs to paint the Spanish as particularly bloodthirsty in their persecution of Protestants, but they weren't anywhere. They weren't any more bloodthirsty in their persecution of heretics than the English were, for example. And the Inquisition itself, it carries on for several hundred years. It's there. I can hear you now. It's
I'm sorry.
Basically the there's a sort of trope about it. People would prefer to be tried by the Spanish Inquisition than the secular courts, because the Inquisition was actually good at taking evidence, and most of the people that brought before the Inquisition were examined and went free. Some maybe given a penance, but most people were not executed by the Inquisition. You have that Mel Brooks or Monty Python vision of it.
Mel Brooks, the Inquisition.
It's a anti-Catholic propaganda of the English.
Yes. I just wanted to say my Skype cuts out 3 times every single time we do this. So that's number one.
Number one. Okay, we got to keep going.
So
right.
Just be aware. There's nothing I can do about it. I've tried.
Okay. Okay. Well, I've
Oh,
answered
you
the
know what? That question actually brings me to one of my other stupid
your next
questions.
question. Okay.
All right. How many witches were burned at the stake?
In the Middle Ages, none.
None? Oh, were they killed in other ways?
No, because they weren't the witch craze is again the 16th century. uh, so heretics were burned at the stake.
Okay.
Witches and this is I okay, so I can answer this. This is one of those things like sugar I can answer in some excruciating detail, but the big takeaway is throughout the Middle Ages, witchcraft was considered a secular crime. It's yeah,
Really?
it's not considered a church concern because
That's
it's
interesting.
malice. It's like cursing. And the thing
So does that mean the church didn't consider it to have any real power then? Like any like they didn't consider spells or curses to have any real power, which if you're a Catholic, they don't against the sacraments, but
right.
yeah.
Well, so in the Dark Ages, like the 10th, 11th century, Burkhard of Worms is one of their famous penitentials, and he points out that people should be getting penance for believing that they can do stuff like that, but not that they can, right?
Ah,
Um,
okay.
Most of the magic that we have evidence of in the High Middle Ages is clerics. It's not witches. It's guys with books, literacy,
Ooh.
and writing in
Boo
Latin,
reading.
right? And my favorite thing is realizing that these guys with books wanting to do magic and summon angels to help them usually want. I mean, one of the most particular things they want is help with their studies. They're low level
Oh, who
clerics
can't
wanting to get
relate to
through
that?
school. Um, it's
I should pray directly to God to help me pass a test.
it's they tell themselves there's I mean they do get into like worse spells and things like that later on in the book, and that's kind of evil and bad, but these aren't don't fit in people's imagination of witches, right? The
Right.
witchcraft stories, the actual quote transformation of witchcraft into something that people could be burned for takes place in the late 15th century, and it depends on inventing a story about them having made a pact with the devil, which then turns them into a concern for the church. But even then,
So
it's there. This goes with the Spanish Inquisition. Even then, it's regional in terms of who gets more caught up in the likelihood of being contained to witch. You know how many witches were burned in Spain by the Inquisition?
50?
Zero.
Zero.
Because the Spanish Inquisition knew it was nonsense, right?
Mm,
A lot of the witchcraft trials, I think they're
because they asked questions.
yeah, the
Yeah.
Spanish were good at
Right.
asking questions. The Inquisitors understood that this is nonsense. Um, it tended to be you had more witchcraft trials in places where the ecclesiastical authorities were weak.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and
So it sounds like they were a bulwark against false
yes,
accusations.
yes,
Interesting.
right.
Yeah, because one of my other questions was how prevalent was witchcraft, but I think you just answered that. You said it was more people who read books, read bad books with bad ideas and got some bad ideas from them.
Well, demonology is a big craze in the late 16th century, but you consider that that's in the context of all of these anxieties over,
The
the
plague.
Reformation. No, the Reformation
Oh,
and I mean, it's like we've
oh.
been reading about this for Draco Chemicus, right? With like John Dee and his summoning angels to talk to them.
Mhm.
There's so much political intrigue and you know like I was saying just now, that the English spread stories about the Spanish Inquisition because they're their political enemies.
Right.
And
And they stand today, which just astounds me how long legs that had,
right,
those legends.
right, right. So
I mean, this is stuff still that gets taught to children in school in the US sometimes. It's ridiculous.
I think there are more burnings in Germany, but it's again it's particular to region, and what my great friend Richard Kiekeffer has done the most like in-depth scholarship on all of these statistics, and what he has said is the trials where think trials happen tend to be situations where the local authorities have different powers, and in places where the church authorities were particularly effective, you don't end up with the same level of witchcraft accusations.
You see, the Salem witch trials fascinate me because I studied it a little bit in college.
They weren't burned, they were
Not a
hanged.
lot. No, they were hanged. But what fascinates me about it is that people still don't know why that hysteria happened. And they're
Right.
still speculating on, I mean, they had a very strong authority, church authority, Protestant, the Puritan church authority. They were the ones not egging them on, but well, I guess sometimes at one particular point they did. I won't recount the story because I don't know it well enough. I'd have to read it again. But they would have these trials where people would be accused of witchcraft, and they would occasionally bring in one of the more well-known pastors, for lack of a better word. I'm not sure what they were called.
President of Harvard.
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mather.
right.
Yeah.
Right, Mather, right, Cotton Mather, and
These intellectuals are very dangerous.
Yeah, he would affirm what was it. I think it might have been him, where they said, "Well, it sounds ridiculous to modern ears to hear stuff like this. It sounds like something Monty Python came up with their famous witch trial, in the Search for the Holy Grail." But one person actually said, "Well, if he's a witch, he can't recite the Lord's Prayer," at which point the accused, a man, started reciting the Lord's Prayer, and Cotton Mather said, "The devil can copy anything. Go ahead, kill him."
Yeah. So so we could do Salem, but that's sort of out of our range here now.
It is out of the range, but why I'm asking is because you said this was happening more so where there was weak ecclesiastical authority,
Yeah.
and so this also happened at a time when whole congregations were turning against the Catholic Church and becoming Protestant churches,
right,
at the same time. So I'm wondering if there was something that the English inherited in the way of this habit of yelling "J'accuse," you're a witch. I'm still perplexed by it, so it just fascinates me. But I know it has something to do with the split.
Yes, and so again, I'm going to keep giving references because I promised that, right? More reading. The great book on this is Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, but there's also a lot more study. He was the one that really it's a giant book I read in graduate school. Brought together all of this study in the 70s, 80s. And has spawned a lot of the discussion since then. And he has details on all of the English witch trials, I believe, but they're really much more, they're in the context of the religious debates that are going on in the 16th century. So it's not as it's not it's funny. It's like the bathing and the witches and all this stuff. These are not medieval phenomenon. They're early modern phenomenon, ironically.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think because of the pejorative, the Dark Ages, when people think of something stupid, they'll automatically assign it to that time period.
Right.
That's what I think's going on.
Right, and there's realizing every time. Well, there's a lot of, let me say, the layers of retelling of which story is which from the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and that's 400 years of retelling the previous story over and over and over again. And that is what we were doing some of that last week too, realizing how many layers you have to work through to get to the point where you're saying, do we really know what was happening?
Yeah. Many layers.
Oh, so many. So we've got, this is Avita. Ava 539 is 1539 is Avita. Hello. What's the deal with Elizabeth? Why do you always say she had a massive influence on our understanding of European history today? I mean, she's queen for a long time, and because she's queen for so long, she very effectively wipes out a lot of the memories of what had been previously. So, if we read Shakespeare now, and you're saying, were the English ever Catholic? And you say, well, maybe Shakespeare's Catholic, and you can feel the sort of Catholic background in it. But it's wild that after the Elizabethan period, the English don't remember. It's her reign is long enough that memories of older traditions die out, I think is,
How long was it?
I can't remember exactly when she comes to power, and she dies in 1603, right?
Hmm.
You can look it up.
It was a long
It was a
time. I think
long
it was something
time.
like 50, it was something like 50 years. It wasn't quite as long as Victoria or Elizabeth
1558.
II.
It's a 1558 to
Yeah.
1603. So yeah, the latter half of the 16th century.
Hmm.
And it's all, I mean, it's also the period, I think, when um a good deal of like, it's not just Shakespeare, it's like English literature kind of picks up at that point. And then
Yeah.
with the King James Bible in 1611, it's like as far back as people can go without having to learn Latin. So you have that effect.
Well, they were recreating, right, their own history.
Right.
They were trying to almost trying to refound English Christendom, so to speak, right?
Well, and her father had had all the
With
monasteries sacked. So you have the
yes,
rupture in the
and then
institutions. Yeah.
right, and Elizabeth actually changed the order of the order of ordination, or something like
Mm,
that. They changed the prayers, and so somebody asked me this question once a long time ago, and I couldn't answer it, but I can now, I think. So the Anglican Church, according to the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church had valid holy orders for like 100 years. When its last bishop died under the old ordination
mm,
rituals that were approved by the Catholic Church, they had no more valid ordinations after that. And so that was really when an actual split happened between the Anglicans and the Catholic Church,
okay.
um, because they lost it at that point. But it was something that Elizabeth did, or her bishops, together with her bishops, because she was the head of the Church of England. I find that ironic. There was another Black legend started of Pope Joan, right?
Hmm.
And I think that was started around her time, which is ironic because she was the head of the Church of England. So she was basically the Pope of the Church of England. Technically, she was Pope Joan, right? She was Pope Eliza.
Right.
So, but so they would start these alternative history, but they were like rumors because obviously they couldn't. I mean, I think they had enough intellectual integrity amongst themselves to realize they couldn't support saying, oh, and it was always like this, because they knew what their history was. So they would just kind of branch it off and change it in subtle ways, like changing the rite of ordination or sacking the monasteries and divvying them up to the supporters of the king, and
Right.
creating you know the Church of England. That's such a subtle phrase right there, because what it really means is we're still Catholic, and a lot of people still believed that, and some people still do. We're still Catholic. We're just the church in England, right? So
Right.
there were all these very, very subtle changes, so subtle, and they still work today. It's diabolical. It's what makes me think the English language is a magic language. It
Oh,
really
yeah.
is. It seems to be able to change reality. That's getting us into some trouble right now, too. Um, pronouns, anyone? Right?
Well, that's nominalism. That's another thing. I'm also think there's an excellent book, Eamon Duffy's book, The Stripping of the Altars, which is just, it's fast. Duffy is a Catholic he's Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a historian of this period, and his account of what the parish religion was like before the Tudors and what it was like losing all of that. I cried, right?
Oh,
Because you have this
yeah.
entire like medieval parish world of saints and feast days and devotions and everything. It's completely wiped out.
It's like your family home being burnt down, isn't
Yeah.
it? You look at it like that, because if you have English heritage or you are English and you read about that, yeah, it would be heartbreaking. Like, oh, that's what happened. The family home burnt down and everything with it.
All of it gone, right? And
Yeah.
the thing that's always been mystifying for me is like, what happened to the devotion to Our Lady? The England was incredibly devoted to Mary from the earliest
Mm-hmm.
conversion. We have very detailed, prayers and things like that from the Anglo-Saxon period. The earliest offices of the Virgin are from two English manuscripts from the late 11th century. There's, major devotional, there's a little devotion, the Walsingham devotion, right? And
Right.
the miracle story collections that spread all throughout Europe start in English monasteries. England was incredibly devoted to Mary, and then by the end of Elizabeth's reign, that's all like gone. So much so that we have ridiculous conversations online now about oh, Mary, and you're just like, do you understand
It does sound like
how
that, yes.
ridiculous theologically that is? But it's like the Elizabethan propaganda was incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's still working.
Yeah,
It's like an antibody. It's still active.
right.
It's seek and destroy any positive Catholic influence, positive Marian influence.
And it's one of those things that I'm collecting books for our reading for Draco Alchemicus, and I found a few recent studies, but it's almost, there's a guy, Gary Weller, who I reviewed one of his books saying like, you turned this into the problem that you said you were trying to solve. It's even in the scholarship hard to figure out why it vanished so completely. Like, you can say, oh well, they're making the cult of Elizabeth and her
Well, they were doing
virgin queen.
that.
They're definitely doing that.
The portrait says that as
Right.
much.
But I think the feeling of the ruthlessness of the persecution of the Protestants is hard to recover, because Shakespeare plays
Yeah.
are so elegant and glamorous and well written and things like that. It just wipes out. And the Shakespearean plays have really been a thing in the way they are now for us since the 19th century. Because there was no
What started that?
there was no stage for hundreds of years. There was Jesus on stage? I'm confusing my stories. How do we keep it up in the early modern period? Guess what? Because most of the stories about the Middle Ages are invented then. Okay.
Yes, we're in the same story. That's why.
Next stupid question, please.
Let me think of. Let me see. Huh.
You realize this is terrifying for me because I'm giving like off the cuff answers to all sorts of things that I'm just desperate to go look up details on.
Well, yeah, I was trying to.
But that was the point. That was the point of this.
Okay, I was trying to find a way to segue, but I can't really
Don't worry about
segue
it.
because these are.
I got. It's like I've been showing pictures from the Apocalypse of Saint Victor. I mean, now we've gotten to Hellmouth. It's one of my students said it looks like the creatures from Where the Wild Things Are.
Yeah. So what happens to a knight whose king is deposed or who loses his kingdom? Do they become itinerant knights like the Ronin of Japan?
No.
See, she's laughing.
No. That's an interesting comparison, and I say no, that doesn't happen. What happens to them? Well, they have to renew their homage. It's some of it is visions of feudalism are always more like clean cut in, say, for example, the legal text than they usually were ever in anybody's lifetime. So the king dies. He hopefully has a son. If his son's not old enough, for example, when either Louis IX or Henry III were in their infancy, the barons all fight each other.
Right. Yeah.
And then
if you picked the wrong horse, what happens to you, I guess, is my question.
Well, it depends on how hard you fought, right? So Simon de Montfort, rises up with the barons against Henry III, and he gets his, chopped to pieces and his body parts spread around England to show what happens to someone who tries to rise up against the king.
They really were cruel.
Yeah.
Cruel bunch.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things they do in Magna Carta is try to prevent the king from claiming certain kinds of carry-on problems like wardships or particularly wardships, because then he could take the property incomes from the women before they get married.
Okay.
There's a lot of rules, right? But no, they don't. Mm-hmm. They don't become Ronin. They're not.
Well,
They're.
I'm kind of disappointed.
I'm sorry. They're not quite as personally bound as because if they're knights and they have fiefs, they have lands, which give them family control, and so the families
Okay.
are always going to be negotiating and jockeying for position at court and things like that as well.
Well,
And they're probably
that's
all
another
related
good
to each
question.
other anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, that's my question. Is like how common was arranged marriage amongst the commoners and the lesser nobility?
So we have oddly in reverse a great deal of evidence about this because the church tries desperately to step in and get in the way of all of that kind of arrangement. And the one sort of interference that the this is how we end up with the Henry VIII, right? And having trying
Hmm.
to get his marriage annulled and the Pope saying no and he's saying okay, blah blah. That from the 12th century, popes had tried to intervene in marriages of kings when, say, I think Philip Augustus is trying to put away his wife and Innocent the Third is saying no, you can't do that. um the church comes up with its theology of marriage as a sacrament that the women have to say yes to, and that's fundamentally a power play against the families who have been arranging those marriages.
Did so they did not always have that?
The
The
clergy
church had
church
to know that
enforcing
didn't.
consent, no, it becomes very much a part of the argument in the 12th century. Prior to that, and Georges Duby has done the best work on this, the way in which the clergy, he did a book called The Knight, the Lady, and the Priest, and it's the way in which the
Mhm.
clergy in the 12th century get themselves in the middle of all of these family political arrangements.
Oh, so what prompted this was to get them out of the marriage brokerage business?
Well,
What prompted the church to?
the church is going the other way for itself because they're also trying to enforce clerical celibacy at that point so that the clergy can't be
Mhm.
trying to hand on properties to their own kin.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
And hand on
that
bishoprics.
that
So I
too.
think that happened
Yes,
too.
right.
Yeah.
And but it is very interesting. The power of the families throughout the Middle Ages is incredibly strong.
Was it stronger in certain areas rather than others? Was it stronger, say, in Italy than in Germany or Spain, or were they all pretty much equal? The
Um,
power of the family.
what a good question. So my colleague Jonathan Lyon has written books about this, so I have to think about what he said.
Hmm.
So he's written about the families in Germany in the 12th century. Families don't last that long. Family lines die out, which is very
Hmm.
interesting. It's like the Habsburgs with their deformed jaws and stuff like that. Having an incredibly successful, long-lived family is actually rare. The French kings, the Capetians, are like one of the reasons they managed to become quite so powerful is somehow by luck or God's providence or who knows what, they're able
Hmm.
from the 10th century into the 14th century to have a father-son succession throughout all of that.
Wow.
Most families can't sustain a lineage that long.
I would say that's Providence. That is
Yeah,
very unusual.
but so families have a great deal of power, but they don't necessarily hold on to it for terrifically long because of like the way the generations don't persist. Jonathan worked
Hmm.
on a family called Ondex, and they're quite powerful from the 11th century through the 13th century, but it's like maybe 150 years. They have a beer. There's Ondex Germany. They have a beer. But
So the family's still around,
the
or it's just the
town's still
name?
around. I'm not the
Uh-huh.
family. I think it depends on things like you having the right number of sons at the right age, and they're marrying off their daughters, and the daughters go off, and I mean it's incredibly difficult drawing all these lineages and such because you're
Yeah.
marrying out, but then they pay attention to who those people are. One, because the church is and saying you
Right.
can't marry your cousin, so they have to know who
Hmm.
they're related to. But two, those marriages are trying to create associations and connections that it means in fact these noble families are related to each other all around. Now in
Hmm.
Italy you have also the town governments playing off against the nobility, the landed people. So it's somewhat different.
Oh, that's interesting. So it sounds like in Italy, you have three. You would have the ecclesiastical, the secular, and then the family, right?
Easily, right? And now you've
Wow.
explained why papal politics are so complicated, because you have the Roman families,
Yeah.
the church hierarchy, and then the Normans showing up every so often and taking, so yeah, it
Just to just to make it
just to make it
interesting.
interesting. This is, I mean, this is, and by the time we get to the High Middle Ages and you have narratives of all of these like interactions and stuff, if you guys are now in an unauthorized world reading the Cambridge Medieval History, you're benefiting from the fact that people wrote all this stuff down. But are you able to keep it straight? Right?
It's like a specialty in accounting I saw once where it's not actuarial. It's something. I'm gonna have to look it up. I can't even remember it. It's basically one guy in a room doing what you just described. It's like the guy with the conspiracy theory board, you know?
Oh yeah.
It's how he can keep everything straight in his head. And he has to have complete silence. This was like 30, 40 years ago. They use computers for it now, but it used to be like one guy doing stuff like this, trying to keep all of these things straight in his head.
And
But
we have some very interesting manuscripts. There's some cool studies of this recently of diagram genealogies, which are incredibly elaborate, right? It's like,
I've seen a couple of YouTube videos
yeah.
on it. I can't even follow those. I can't even imagine trying to read it and follow it.
Well, one of the coolest ones we have in our collection at Chicago. I had a student who did a paper on the, and it's from Wigmore Abbey, and it's the Mortimer family, and they're trying to use this genealogy to prove that they should be king of England.
Awesome.
In the late 14th century, it's the
That sounds like
challenge. It's
fun.
after the challenge to Richard the Second. And the Mortimers, the Mortimers win in the long run because they're ancestors of the Tudors. And one of the things in this manuscript is showing this sort of Welsh connection that they have. But our manuscript, this Wigmore Abbey manuscript, they're trying to prove by way of both, men and women in these lineages, because they trace their one of the lines back to this Welsh princess, right?
Yeah, well, that's when it becomes really interesting,
Yeah.
though, because you have to go to a certain point in time and figure out, okay, what were they doing at this time? Were they doing it just to the male or through the females also, or a combination of both? And did it ever change? I know just changed recently in England today.
Today. Wow.
With the princess. Well, today, I mean, this day and age,
Okay.
with Princess Charlotte, because they changed it. So instead of if William, if will, if William it's not sorry, what is William's son's name? I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Prince William's is anyway. If his firstborn son dies, his secondborn child is a daughter. She becomes queen, even though she has a younger brother. So
Wow. Well, so
yeah, yeah, that's a big change.
well, anyway, yes, I mean, the English now, they can't be Catholic, right? So that's the the Hanoverian, tap came because they had closer relatives who were Catholic. Um,
One of the Hanoverian princesses, like current modern day, became a Catholic in the last couple of years, and she was in the line of secession in England, and that was
and now
gone
she's
when she
not. Yeah.
converted. Yeah.
Well, anyway, so we have pretty good records for a lot of these lines. But one of the things that one of my stepfather got very interested in doing his own ancestry, like through things like ancestry.com and stuff, and he claimed to have gotten lines all the way back to the 8th century. It's hard to do that because there's breaks in our knowledge, right? I asked Jonathan, it's like, can you get through the German lineages to everybody's related to Charlemagne because he had enough kids and they all intermarried and
Yeah.
but the records are better than you'd think often, to be able to do this kind of
They're
work.
better in some countries than others, though. I'm sure, right? Just because they must have
I have to answer this one. I can answer this one. Okay, Linguist Bear. Excuse the topic, but is it true in feudalism the lords had the right to be with someone's wife? No!
Prima Nocta is not a thing.
19th century fantasy, and there's an entire book about it by Alain Barreau, and which I was just reading recently. It's again, it's another of these slanderous political accusations that there are sort of weird layers of the three references to something or other, but what I think is happening, it's one of those things that becomes very popular in the 19th century, and it's the lords are stealing the people's wives. Who are the lords in the 19th century? They're the factory owners. Why would they be stealing people's wives? Because women are all going to work in the textile factories. And interestingly, in French political sort of propaganda, one of the things that they come up with is, the factory owners are stealing our wives. That probably did happen. Like, the women get taken off into these towns and bad things happen. But
yeah,
no, the lords did not have the right to sleep with anybody. That's a total fantasy.
and the factory owners didn't have that right.
No,
either.
and they didn't either. Everybody thinks this is bad.
Yeah,
but it's if you there is a good detailed study of it, but the short answer is no. It's a myth. Linguist Bear, Mel Gibson, wrong. I've heard that it feels like it would cause too many problems. Linguist Bear, you're right. It would cause too many problems. It's nonsense.
Yeah,
they are actually all Christian. Now,
not necessarily good ones.
No, and they have mistresses and things like that. But right? No, the Mel Gibson is wrong in that particular sense.
I remember you saying it drove your father crazy watching that movie.
Yeah, well, Dad was upset about the battlefields. He said that Sterling battle was fought over a bridge or something, and there was no bridge in the movie. And also, Dad was a smoker, and the movie was long, and so he had to have a reason to get mad, so he can leave it have a cigarette.
That's funny. Yeah.
I can't stay. And he leaves.
That's a long movie. They need a smoker's intermission for sure. Let's all go to the lobby and have ourselves a smoke. Yeah.
You're dating yourself that you know that song. Okay.
Oh, I don't know why it's been swimming in my head. It's actually way before my time, but it's an earworm.
Okay. Your next question. How are we doing? I hope it's plausible. I'm going to give bibliography at the end of this so everybody can go read better accounts than what I'm giving.
Let me find a good one here.
The Prima Nocta one is a good thing to come up because that's like of the fantasies in the middle. We've dealt with hygiene, witchcraft, and the first night.
Okay.
Doing well.
Here is what's that if we have not discussed? Alchemy.
Ooh. Okay. I might be able to answer stuff on that. Go ahead.
Witchcraft or just proto-chemistry? What was it?
So I just started reading a book today on alchemy and the Virgin Mary and the way in which Catholics and Protestants both use alchemical stuff in the 16th and 17th century. So now I have to strip that off of what you just asked. Some of it seems to date back to antiquity in terms of chemical transformations and such. How did you phrase the question? Is it chemistry
did they just view it as like proto-chemistry, just like the beginnings of modern chemistry, or did people consider it witchcraft? Because I know I saw those pictures of the alchemy museum in Prague, and noticed it was underground and it looked like it was kind of secret. So was it secretive? Or are these just trade secrets?
In the 16th century, yes. See what I did there? No, in Prague in the 16th century, it's another of these, like John Dee went to Prague, and who is it in Prague? I've forgotten his name. He's collecting a lot of these guys around. It's another of these 16th century phenomenon. In the High Middle Ages, the alchemical texts, they come through Arabic translations. Alchemy is also an ancient Greek system of secrets and knowledge and such.
Was it just to turn base metals into gold, or was it much more broad than that? The field.
It's more broad than that. Okay, so what I'm seeing in the 13th century, one of my guys that I'm working on, Serva Sanctus of Faenza, in his Marian treatise, mentions when he's talking about Marian images of gold, alchemy, right? And so there's already a kind of spiritual association in the Franciscans. People like Roger Bacon get very interested in alchemy. I think at at that level, they're trying out lots of experimental things. Bacon is very interested in optics experiments and such, and so he's associated with some of the alchemical tests. But there's this other Franciscan, John of Rupecissa, in the mid 14th century, who, and I'm defaulting to, I have the book on my shelf and I need to read it. It's Leah Devon's book on John. He actually, one, he gets very interested in apocalyptic predictions, and two, comes up with, in his alchemical studies, this distillation of the fifth essence, right? It's aquavitae. It's actually like, I think it's like alcohol, right? And but it's through Rupecissa, and this is where it goes into the book that I was reading about the Virgin Mary in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's through Rupecissa that you get this blending of kind of mysticism and the chemical transformations. And John, and I'm sort of like, I think he's following on Roger, because I remember doing a paper in college on Roger Bacon and his idea of species. And I was trying to, Bacon had this idea that if you perfectly balance the humors, you could live forever. So we're back with.
So was
our Galenic medicine, right?
Right. I was going to say, how is that different than
Rupecissa seems to include in his ideas about the quintessence that if you could create this, it could extend life, right? And that turns into what then in the early modern period becomes this blending of, you're doing these, alchemical studies and they're real operations, right? There's Lawrence Principe has done work that he does the chemistry and shows that the kinds of like secret transformations that the alchemists describe in their books actually work. Like they're.
So they weren't interested in health; they were interested in enhancement. Right.
Well, yes,
longer life.
I think it's through Rupecissa that it turns into this, search for the prolongation of life. But the thing is that it's kind of both mysticism and science, and neither.
Yeah.
And the 16th and 17th century is just plain weird, right? See, we ended up there again, right? You thought you were asking questions about the Middle Ages, and again, it's the 16th and 17th centuries.
Again, it's the 16th century, right? Because we're thinking of, wizards with big tall hats and, beakers and,
Well, John Dee wears that little skull cap in his drawing, so I'm not sure where we get the pointy hat thing, but...
Mickey Mouse, of course. It's Merlin, right? Mickey's the apprentice Mickey, right? Because it's the Dark Ages, right? It's alchemy and people
right, but it's the 16th
think of changing base metals into gold, right? Which is what they've been doing way before the Middle Ages, right? They've been trying that. I think some poor guy even tried it in China and got executed when he couldn't do it. So
well, it's fiddling the money supply.
Yeah.
So that's why. I mean, one of the reasons that it's so popular in the 16th century is the monarchs are all broke, and they're
trying to figure out how to do it. They're making their own Bitcoin.
Yes.
I've got a brand new currency. Trust me.
Anyway, what we're establishing here is there's a lot of weird things that begin in the Middle Ages that flourish into the early modern period. Yeah. And that's when we say like what's medieval. What's funny about it is like you've got the printing press from the mid 15th century, and so the world changes because our level of ability to see what people are talking about changes because you got printed books. Mm-hmm. But one of the big things they're printing throughout the 16th, 17th century is medieval books. So it's like most of the books printed in the 16th, 17th century are actually fact written in the 12th century, in the 13th century.
Oh, that's why we think it's all medieval. That's it.
Yes, maybe. Yeah, because in the 17th century, they're still reading all this medieval literature. And more of modernity is embedded in this stuff than people realize. Most of the time when you have like sort of slanderous descriptions of stuff, they're contemporaries fighting with each other, right? So what's medieval? Oh, it's, my next door neighbor who I want to make look bad. in my scholarship.
So I'm going to say that you know, the alchemy, there were trade secrets they were protecting. It's not that it was witchcraft. It's not that people thought it was witchcraft. It's that people assigned real value to it.
Well, remember what I said about, the guys who are doing all the angel magic or clerics?
Yes.
The people that are interested in that kind of experimental stuff tend to try everything, right? So I think that it's like Newton allegedly, did a lot of alchemy studies and hopefully predicting the end of the world and stuff. Got very interested in apocalypticism as well. The kind of curiosity that these sorts of studies feed tends to feed into adjacent
Gotcha.
materials. Do you have any questions about the Middle Ages for me?
I thought I did.
Now we've established that many of the myths
I thought I had several pages of questions about relation. Every single last one of them was,
end up in the 16th century.
16th century.
No, this is it's like no.
Except the bathing and toilet paper one. Those were like legitimately Middle Ages questions.
Yeah, I don't think they used toilet paper. They maybe used rags. They certainly,
Yeah.
water.
Ugh.
That's a bidet for those of you who know French.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was it. I only had one other question, and it's not even a medieval question. I was just kind of, well, maybe it's a medieval question. I think it's more like a difference between what happens in Catholic countries and what happens in Protestant countries for out of wedlock births. What's the attitude towards that?
Get married.
Shotgun wedding in both cases?
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly, right? Yeah.
So I have a graduate student who's been working this past year on, guess what, the 16th century.
Uncanny.
But she's looking at the ecclesiastical courts for court. It's in Lancashire, right? Whaley Court, and she's done some really great study, sort of piecing through all of the names and these are church courts, and this is before the Reformation, right? So before they're abolishing all of these older practices. And I mean, one of the funny things is like the sworn men of the town have to bring before the court when the visitation is happening accusations that they have, and some of the guys that are brought for sex crimes in the sense of like fornication and stuff are themselves also sometimes the guys doing the sworn men part. So it's complicated. I mean, certainly, yeah, adultery was a thing, fornication was a thing. Sometimes they can't figure out who the babies are, like whose baby it is. I think there's a child.
Yeah, well, because the guy's saying it's not mine,
or the women are not saying who the fathers are, right? It's complicated. I think what it sounds like for the most part, what they wanted was, if it's the people aren't married and they're not married to anybody else, they should get married and have the children. Yeah. Right.
So one of the when I first met you, you recommended a book called anyway, it was about the 4 English migrations to America.
Albion Seed, yeah.
Albion Seed, right. And the one thing that stuck in my mind was the marriage folkways of the borderlanders between England and Scotland that moved to what is now Appalachia. And their tradition was basically, yeah, we know you're going to do it. Just get married when you have the baby. Yes. And you were expected to get married. And if the man took off, there would be a posse chasing you and dragging you back and making you marry the mother of your child. Right. I thought that was kind of interesting. So I think I'm gonna presume they inherited that from way back when, and it was more cultural than even a time period thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, it's one of those things we'll know things like we have a lot of the law, the canon law about what marriages, what happens with marriages, and there's like big debates. I mean, because you're not supposed to get divorced, and there's a whole this was, in grad school. What am I doing when I'm looking through the illustrated copies of Gratian's Decretum? Oh, you got to look for the test for impotence because those are the silliest pictures, right? Because you'd have to go like test the guy.
I think I've seen some of those. They're really,
they're impotent. They're impotence
you have
tests.
you have no context, and you see this doodle from the Middle Ages. You're like,
Have
what
it
am I
been shown
looking
that he's and those are from legal manuscripts, right? And they're trying to prove that he can't consummate the marriage so they can annul it. But
gosh.
sort of the actual what actually happened stuff, again, it was interesting for this student. She wanted to work on something that was like people's real lives, and she found these ecclesiastical courts, these acts of these ecclesiastical courts, and even she spent like a year and a half really combing through trying to get exactly the families and the names and the relationships and stuff. And even with this level, she's got a lot of names and associations. There's all sorts of like open questions of exactly what happened to the children or the parents, or I mean, sometimes she says sometimes it's even hard to tell whether there is a child, right? It's like, or there's evidence of the sex crime because there is a baby, but the woman's not saying who the father was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like there was more records related to the fact that there was a court than there were records of the actual people involved in the proceedings.
It's more that they're not, what they're putting in their records is not the full story of what we want to know,
Right.
and so it's frustrating.
And maybe that was maybe that was for privacy. Who knows?
I don't think they had much privacy in these situations. It's like they were in the barn. We know they were in the barn.
We saw you go in there. We know you're going to do it. Just get married.
Kind of.
Right.
And it does seem like and there's some guys that are like brought before the court as ones that have been caught in these situations, and then later they're ones that that seems like the same person is being one of the testifiers against other people, right? So it's like, how do you enforce social norms? This at these levels, it's some of this kind of what are your neighbors up to?
Yeah. Well, 15-minute cities. It'll make a comeback.
It would. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily. There are ways in which it could be good, right? So like, I'm in the park talking to one of my newer neighbors, right? He's only lived here 2 years, and I'm like, yeah, I'm one of the old ladies. But we've lived here for 20 plus years now, and it's like, and I could tell you on that corner back in 20 years ago, 10 years ago, there was this, and I'm just like, I can't believe I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of neighborhood is? Well, back in '08 we had a murder, but
back in '08, you got to say '08. It sounds older.
But you've got to consider that people were able to do that, right? And so and therefore the kind of rupture that Eamon Duffy described in Stripping of the Altar is when you've wrecked that entire network of people. I mean, it's huge. It's huge. The Reformation was catastrophic socially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, still is.
And that we think of the Middle Ages is because the Reformation was, giant cover up, particularly in England, of that catastrophe.
It's year zero.
Yeah.
Right. It's like any huge upheaval. It's like, okay, we're going to start counting now. Right. Forget everything that happened. Those were dark times. The Dark Ages. You don't need to know anything about that.
Precisely.
It's year zero.
Precisely.
Right.
They whitewashed over the murals. They, just destroyed a lot of the art. The manuscript.
There are people who think that the first Bible was the King James Bible. They think that that's the first time any of these were put together.
Right.
It's a sad lack of education about our own history as a Christian people.
Right.
It's like, even if you love the King James Bible, I had one for years. It's a pretty language. It's missing some books, but it's an interesting historical book to have. It's not it's not where the history of Christianity begins. And sadly, it seems like a lot of people think that. Yeah.
Well, okay, so with literacy, going back to, this is Pelayo's question at the beginning. So there's a propaganda behind literacy, obviously. And the major claim that people have about, people in the Middle Ages, they didn't get to read, the clergy weren't allowing anybody to read. One, it's wrong. We have, particularly in towns, we know town people arrange for the education of their children. And there are different urban areas in the Middle Ages, the northern Italy, which we mentioned already, and the Low Countries as well, like Belgium now, Netherlands. They're very urban. They're very educated. The thing that they generate, particularly in the Low Countries, is more prayer books, right? You get lots and lots of books of hours from that region. But we know also, the townspeople involved in things like the textile industry are starting to write in the vernacular from the 12th century. They're keeping records. They're, learning to keep their accounts and things like that. Literacy it's functional, but it's also devotional throughout the High Middle Ages. But with the printing press, the printing press only works because you've got you've got like a market already, because people can already read, right? It's like who are you going to sell books to if nobody can read? So that the printing press takes off in the mid 15th century, they obviously already have a literate population wanting more books. So that's good. And the earliest, big print runs of things are, guess what? Prayer books. So by the time the Reformation comes along, the slander that, the church never let anybody read is dumb. And
yeah, it was 100 years after the Gutenberg's printed the first Bible.
Right. Well, it's 1455 is the Gutenberg press. But the thing is, there's a market for it. There's, lots and lots of books printed in that first 50, 60, 70 years. And the Protestants are, therefore, they're propagandizing against the Catholics, saying, oh, they don't let you read. Well, guess what the Catholics are doing? Setting up, printing presses and making standardized liturgies. It's like the printing press affects everybody, and everybody gets, more fixed on. It's like when computers come out and everybody needs a computer. So the
that's repeated today.
Yes,
the Catholic Church didn't let people read. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's like, why do they? Well, look, it's in Latin. It's like, yeah, a lot of people read Latin. They did. Educated people did.
Right.
And they owned books, but they also printed them in English or vernacular.
Well, the vernacular. So ironically, the vernacular is actually more limiting than Latin, because if you print a book in Latin, everybody in Europe can read it. Who can read, right? If you print it in your local dialect, 10 people can read it. And we expect
there were many more dialects in Europe back then than there were today.
Right. So Latin,
many more. Even 100 years ago, there were.
It did the same thing English does now. It's like India uses English now because there's too many local dialects of everything else. So it was the thing that enabled you to participate in the bigger network of people. But the sort of emphasis on, you must learn to read. Again, the Protestants, why did you want literacy? To read the Bible. Literacy is, we think of it now, thanks to the public education system of the 20th century, is about citizenship and such. It was always primarily about being able to pray.
Right. And even our own public schools used the Bible to teach reading 100 years ago. That's right. How much we've changed.
So yeah, the great forgetting is since they cut out school prayer, and we've been dumbed down more than anybody in the Middle Ages. The Dark Ages now.
It's astounding what a common education was back then. How many subjects had to be mastered by the age of like 14 or 16.
Right.
Which was college age back then, which now, 14 or 15-year-old goes to college. It's like, oh, wow, they're a prodigy, which they would be today. But I don't think that was not true centuries ago. They were taught what is today considered difficult subjects from a very young age.
Well, certainly the ones that right. This is another layer. Maybe we should do another. Maybe we should. You had good questions, and they all answered the 16th century. No, wait.
See, I am dumb. They were dumb questions because they're not middle age.
But But I think
I've succeeded
we've
my
demonstrated
task.
the problem of people's, it's like your without history, we have no sense, obviously, of who we are or what anything means. It's like it's we're well, one, we're Christians, so we believe in time, but the sort of events in time actually have significance, and so it matters to track them carefully. But understanding how much of our sense of a as a people we depend on propagandized versions of the past, pretty important. I lost her again. Okay, so while we're waiting, okay, that's two. So I have here my homepage. Um, and you guys, if you want like more details and like footnote me and please don't test me on what I said live. Um, that I did on unauthorized this course on medieval history 101, the unauthorized version. I mainly did early Middle Ages in England, so like the conversion of England and what happens with um I did one on Charlemagne's elephant, so I must have done some on the Carolingians. But I've taught courses at the University of Chicago for 30 years now, and all of the syllabi, well, there's syllabi for all of the courses, although not all the syllabi because I didn't put one for every single time I taught the course. I'm scrolling down. Look how far you have to scroll down past. Ooh, look, Draco Chemicus, Nora Borealis. If you go down all the way down here to teaching, I have syllabi for my courses in European civilization, Knights and Samurai, War in the Middle Ages, Tolkien, my various history colloquium, or which are like craft level, how do you do history courses. I have courses for both undergraduates and graduates. These are more thematic things on education, like the quadrivium and the trivium. Medieval Christian mythology is, of course, I just taught this past quarter on the. If you're wondering about those images I've been showing in the Saint Victor Apocalypse, we deal with the like backstory mythology of seeing God in that course. But I've also done courses on medieval England, on cities, on animals, and if you click on these, you'll get to the syllabi for all of those. And then if you really want to go into this, the graduate colloquium seminars are more on the beginning research level of things in liturgy and devotion and biblical commentary and theology. I don't really do theology, religious thought more, the sort of prayer and mysticism and things like that. And then, if you really want to get into this, we have the Medieval European History Oral Starter List, which if you were a graduate student, after you've done various courseworks for 2 or 3 years, you would then be given a giant list of books that you could read to get into the field. And this, my colleague Jonathan and I put this together about almost 8 years ago, 2016. And it gives you a sense of like some of the classics in the field to give the feel of it, the way in which we've been telling the story more recently. I basically make book reading lists for my job, and there's lots more reading lists out there. There's some on our Dragon Common Room site and such. And with Casey's questions and your guys' questions, I'm thinking of yet more books that should be on the list. But it should feel like a dynamic problem that you're constantly figuring out where you are in the story, and you know
It's a dynamic time period
it's a very
for
dynamic time
sure.
period. And
There's so many different directions to go to read. That's why there's so many books, but they're fascinating. They are.
but it should feel like what we've been doing tonight, which is this: what do I think I know? Okay, I'm curious about that. Social history questions like the toilet paper stuff. It's interesting things that we do know and that we don't know. And sometimes you're like, how have nobody ever said that or thought that or wondered about it? And oh yeah, in fact, in the older scholarship, everybody knew, and so we just stopped talking about it.
Hmm.
In the medieval England course, I do use a book by a Mortimer, I forgot what his first name is, on like life in medieval England, and that kind of stuff will go through like the clothing and the coinage and you know more daily life details. I tend to work more on the what did they pray details than the daily life details.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah. I like the daily life details, as you can tell from several of my stupid questions.
it's so there's a, I mean, what's interesting is social history is way hard because to get those sorts of details, you're I mean, I'm reading the text like Servus Sanctus for what he says about Mary and all this imagery. Oh, but there's, this thing where he references alchemy, right? And it'll be like one paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And to put together the sort of full picture of everything that we know, it'll be a lot of that kind of incidental mentions of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a book that on markets in medieval Italy that I want to be reading right now, and I may have more answers to some kinds of questions after I look at that. Yeah. Anyway.
I can see more questions coming in your mind.
Always. There are always more questions. It's like the fun is like, oh my gosh, now I don't know. I need to go find out.
Yeah. That's yeah. Now I have to know something. It's something I don't know yet.
And, well, and also your primary experience is, okay, I didn't know this much. Now I don't know this much.
Right.
It's like
careful which door you open.
You filled in this stuff that you know, but the boundaries of what you don't know have just gotten bigger too. So yeah,
it's the TARDIS, right? You see this cute little door. I'm going to open it, see what's behind there, and it's this giant stadium, right?
Always
500 more doors right, to open.
So now, a lot of things are the 16th century. So I've had much of what we have in modernity is like, this is why Tartaria is fun to do, because, it's like, oh, the world was completely invented in 1850. And it's like, sometimes you kind of feel like that because there's so many things that are
first.
Yeah. They're like, how long has X been, around? It's like 200 years basically now.
Yeah.
Since 1850 or so. But the Middle Ages, a lot of it is, it's back projected images from the 16th century when they were remembering their own past and forgetting a lot of it at the same time.
That's fascinating. I think that's what makes it such a fascinating time.
Yeah.
Because there was an explosion of knowledge, but there was also an explosion of invention of fake knowledge.
Yes.
Of the past, projected onto the future, and it's still going strong today. So it's yeah. It's definitely a catalyst.
There are no stupid questions, only not enough stamina.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I like that.
Okay, well, I think class dismissed. We're losing our audience right now. I think it maybe unauthorized has kicked out, and we didn't get any questions. I was looking at the chat in Dragon Common Room, and we've got Mel posting pink rabbits. Okay, I think we're done.
Rabbits. I'm trying to make the connection.
I'm not sure. She's being
sexy
about she's being sexy about Harrison Butker. Okay, that's a different topic. Night, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Subscribe, go and look at my webpage and read more books. We'll see you next week.